Hi, I'm Joan Goodchild, Editor-in-Chief of CSO, and welcome to another edition of Security Sessions, where we talk about trends and topics important to security managers. Today, I'm going to be talking to Stephen Boyer. He is the CTO and co-founder of BitSight, and we are going to be talking about what CSOs can learn from the recent DNS attack. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell me a little bit about BitSight before we get started.
BitSight is the leading security ratings company. We rate companies on their cybersecurity performance for use cases in third-party risk management, mergers and acquisitions, cyber insurance, and board-level benchmarking.
So these recent attacks, I mean, pretty surprising. I think, a lot of people were kind of surprised, how they worked, what happened. What do you think from an enterprise level was kind of one of the biggest surprises that came out of the Dyn attacks?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest surprises is the interdependency of companies these days, right? Some of the web's largest properties were impacted by a relatively obscure, at least from a consumer standpoint, company in New Hampshire where they were attacked, and it really created downtime for some of the world's largest web properties like Twitter and Spotify. And so I think enterprises have to think about, that's surprising that one company could have such a big impact on some of the largest internet companies.
Right, and so this interconnectedness sounds like it's probably necessary in a lot of cases, but are companies now relying too much on cloud-based services or fourth parties?
Great question. It really depends on the organization's risk posture and the services they're trying to provide. The reason why they're becoming dependent and outsourcing is because these companies are experts. They provide that service at a lower cost. Oftentimes they have distributed networks across the globe so they can offer even more resilience. And so thus, hey, you get that benefit, you outsource and become dependent on those. The real challenge becomes what happens when that dependency has an issue, when that dependency can no longer function. They're really worried about, well, how can I provide my services? So I think deciding if I'm either too dependent or not is really a function of, well, what's my risk? If I'm needing to provide a web property and advertising, or in Twitter's case, a stream that's constantly up, I really have low risk tolerance for these types of outages, where other people say, well, I may have a higher tolerance for that depending on the kind of business I'm in. And so deciding whether or not you're either more or less dependent on it really depends on the business context.
And so going a little bit further into that, I mean, depending on the business context, depending on what they do, the services they provide, what kind of factors should they consider when they're looking at their risk profile and their dependency?
Well, certainly if you're on the internet and you're consumer facing, the consumers are expecting a certain type of experience, right? They're expecting a service to be up constantly, slow or quick response times, and so if you're in a very internet-facing business, your margin for error is much lower, especially if you're providing service to somebody else. Netflix, we understand, is a consumer of these types of services. Well, millions of consumers are expecting their Netflix to be on when they show up. They want to watch their TV shows. And so if you're in that kind of business where you expect to have high reliability of uptime, especially when somebody's coming in to see it, right, you're going to have to be able to manage that risk a little bit tighter than somebody else who's maybe oil and gas, where their internet-facing presence isn't as important as maybe their delivery channels.
Let's explain a little bit more about what these attacks were, for people watching who don't necessarily understand it. Denial of service attacks. How did this happen? Why does that interconnectedness matter? What were some of the components that went into this?
Now, first, it's important to understand this is not a hack. This is not a breach of a system where people are losing records. It's effectively overwhelming these systems with requests. Hey, I'm going to request this service again and again and again, and when it becomes too busy, right, it's just overwhelmed and can no longer respond. The way this happened, and it's been studied after the fact, is that hundreds of thousands of devices on the internet, often called Internet of Things, which is cameras and other sorts of internet-connected devices, were compromised and taken over, and then they made these requests. This is called fake or junk traffic that just overwhelmed the services of this DNS provider. And DNS is the service that takes a website name to an IP address that allows machines to communicate. And because those devices were making so many requests that were distributed, it was just too much for the service provider to handle, and that those systems downstream, like Twitter and Spotify, that depended on it, were no longer able to serve that up. Getting to the motivations for why these attacks took place, I don't think anybody fully understands why they were the target, but what this could mean is it could really be any organization. Any organization could be the target of these, and there's a history of this. Not too long ago, the financial services industry was targets of these denial of services, and there's not a whole lot you can do. right? You can't stop them from happening. There's really only mitigation strategies.
So you just said there's not a whole lot you can do, but just to get into that a little bit deeper, what if you were one of these companies that's in the midst of this? I mean, are there any other options other than to wait and see what happens with Dyn, or are there things that you could be doing in the midst of this?
You absolutely can be proactive. You can't stop the DDoS from happening because people are going to make those requests, so you can't necessarily stop that. But what you can be is ready. Right? You can have had visibility, you could have analyzed what your dependencies look like, and then taken a risk management strategy to counteract that. So in terms of chief security officers, what can they think about? They need to be thinking about what are the dependencies for the business? What does that mean if any one of those dependencies were to go down? And what is my backup strategy? And so that's going to vary from organization to organization in terms of what they're willing to accept for cost and complexity. But they absolutely can be thinking about these are the technologies, these are the types of mitigation strategies that I can employ. For distributed denial of service, there are really only kind of two different strategies. You can throttle. It means I'm only going to allow so many requests to go through, and I'm going to be able to only service so many, or I'm going to try to mitigate or block it. And so you're saying, okay, I'm going to try to do one of these. Now there are lots of different services that provide these, right? I'm going to either use some of these services or employ some of my own. And I think some reasonable strategies now is to use a blend, right? You have organizations that specialize in this, they have sorts of services and infrastructure. Now, do you want to be overly dependent on that? Well, you may have to have some of your own depending upon the complexity and your risk management structure.
So those are great points about things to be thinking about. What other sorts of future thinking, or what kind of a checklist could we give to CSOs who were not only impacted but also observed this and are very concerned about their own organizations now? What are some great action items that you would suggest so that they can try to be prepared for next time?
Now, firstly, I have to understand your susceptibility. What is my susceptibility to something like this? That's going to mean who are my service providers and what are my dependencies on those service providers? The second one is how are we trained to respond? Even though maybe we've had a mitigation plan, have we worked through that action plan? Do we know what step 1, step 2, step 3 of that playbook would be? And 3, have I put the technologies in place? Because no human response is really going to be able to fully cope with attacks like this, and so you need to have investments in technology as well. So technology, training, and visibility into what the potential impact could be in that situation.
Do you anticipate we'll see a lot more of this as time goes on?
The trend shows that. The trends has shown this where, for a variety of different reasons, it could be people trying to extort money out of you. They may be trying to get back at you for something, your political speech or that sort of thing. It could be anywhere from criminal activity to nation-state activity, and we've seen this happen, which is as organizations have tried to protect themselves more and more from somebody getting in, well, you can always execute a distributed denial of service attack against somebody. So the trend certainly suggests it's going that way, and organizations need to be prepared.
Great. I want to thank Stephen Boyer of BitSight for joining us today. And for more on the Dyn attacks, which we've closely followed over the last several weeks, as well as other business continuity and data protection issues, check out CSO Online. I'm Joan Goodchild, and thanks for watching.